Sorry.
I guess at what point does the idea of original sin come? It seems kind of like Paul kind of has that concept when he talks about Adam bringing sin into the world and Christ bringing life to it.
Yeah, the concept of original sin as we have come to know it actually was probably around 500 years or so after the story of Genesis, what they started putting it on paper. So you have literally, and I was going to just mention this because, and I'm glad that you brought it up, is that the stories that they start to talk about where they're starting to originate some of these stories is around 12 to 1500 years before Jesus. This is when some of these oral traditions are beginning to develop. Remember, this teaching of people when it came to about the creation of the world and those kinds of things, these were told through what we call narrative stories. These were and they were passed down. Most of this was not written down, but passed down by word. And so you have well over 1,000 years of oral tradition, and finally it comes to about the 600s or 700s or 700s BC, when the Davidic kingdom starts to join people and they actually have some sense of peace, is that you now have different groups starting to write things down. And then from there, you have about 500 or so years later, when they are in exile, 583 BC, is that now you have leaders as they are in exile. They are under some pretty tough conditions, but the recognition is we need to write this down or we're going to forget it. And so they're drawing the sources from all different places. They're drawing sources from the four people that we will talk, or the four groups we will talk about, that we've already talked about a bit: Yahwist, Elohist, Priestly, and Deuteronomic. These are kind of the major groups that are sorting and putting together these stories, these histories, these oral histories. So you're starting to draw from all of that, plus you're drawing from the stories of what are called Gilgamesh, from the Mediterranean peoples. You're drawing from all sorts of groups and stories that were out there. It would be similar to us if we were to tell the story of, hundreds of years later, we were to tell the story of whether it's the falling of the towers, or it would be, some tragic event. And we would draw from all sorts of literature of that day and that age, or before. And so we could draw from, Dr. Zhivago. We could draw from, the Christmas Carol. We could draw all sorts of major literary pieces and genre. We would draw from that to tell the story of what we learned with the destruction of the Twin Towers. Because remember, we're the ones that have, recording devices and all of that stuff. They didn't have any of that. So theoretically, if all of those electronic things that somehow record and tape were all destroyed, we would have to tell the story in a different way. And so this story now is being collected with resources from all over the place, whether scriptural or not, whether factual or not, and they're trying to tell the story of, creation and why things are the way they are. And they're trying to do that now and write it down so that they can pass it on to future generations. So once you put all of that together, about 500 years before Jesus, is that now when it comes to Jesus, who would have been familiar with all of these stories, obviously the Pentateuch, the 5 books, is that he would have gleaned what he was teaching, from the Pentateuch and from other resources of his time, the wise rabbis of his time. He would have gathered information from them, plus what would have been revealed to him by the Father, no question. And so now what you're doing is you're taking all of that and you are passing it on to those who are to come after you, namely the apostles and Paul and those who have experienced now the whole crucifixion, the life, death, resurrection time of Jesus. So now you have literally a Christian community that is pretty much on the outs with Rome because, they are seen as rabble rousers. They are seen as those people who are trying to upset, you might say, the norm that Rome has put into place, and which the Jewish leadership in many ways supported because they were benefiting from it. Again, not that they were necessarily bad people, but let's just say they lost the sense of who was to be God and where their bread was buttered, really was buttered on what side. Now, so you have this Christian or this group called the Way, which Paul, by the way, in a sense, no pun intended, where Paul, his goal is to destroy this group. And so he has been given permission by Jewish leadership to drag these people off, to prison. He has his conversion experience, and now he talks about where does sin enter the world. This is not original sin yet. That concept hasn't been developed yet. That comes after the Roman Empire becomes the Holy Roman Empire, and now those who were on the outs are in the ins, and those who were the ins are on the outs. And before it wasn't good to be aligned with Christianity, now it's to your benefit to be aligned with Christianity because now they've got the army to kick your butt if you don't agree with them. And so what happens then is that as this Holy Roman Empire now gets more and more settled, and you basically have a theocracy because now the church is not only and church leadership is not only, you might say, your political structure, it's also your theological structure. And now you have the philosophers and the desert fathers and all of these people starting to reflect what was the Genesis experience. Now, many of them using very poor translations, that's one thing, and many of them looking and approaching the Bible as if it were literally God spoke in the ear of those who wrote it down, and they wrote it down word for word as God spoke to it. As God spoke it. We no longer espouse that concept that it is literal. And so still at the time you have some of the great theologians, when you think about like Tertullian and Augustine and all sorts of guys and folks like that, mostly guys, of course. Now you have all of this theologizing going on, and they're talking about what is this? What is sin, and when did it begin? Because remember, in Genesis, there's no mention of sin. That doesn't happen. Not in the whole book of Genesis. In the creation stories, there's no mention of sin. Was the snake a frisky little devil? Yeah, well, not devil in the bed. Yeah, in that sense of the term. Yes, but this isn't about sin. This is about disobedience. This is about relationships. This is about lots of other things. But it is not labeled as sin. That concept doesn't come until much later, as the theologians and the philosophers, and all of those talking head people, put their heads together, and they eventually come up with these concepts. So that is much later in development. You're talking, after Jesus, you're talking a good 500 some years over time, because who is it? Let's see, Augustine is in the 400s. Tertullian is around that same time. You have all of this happening. So many of these concepts that we have grown up with and are very familiar, we're very familiar with, these were things that were developed much later. Our sacramental system was developed much later. So when they talk about Jesus didn't invent reconciliation, he didn't invent marriage, he didn't invent anointing or any of the sacraments as far as that goes. Do we go to scriptures to find foundational pieces for all of that? Yes, but there is no place in the scriptures one can say, oops, that's where he invented marriage. Oops, that's where he invented baptism. These are at times when writers and the storytellers were writing it all down, they were also inserting some of their own issues and some of their own biases. Remember, each of the gospel writers has their own bias. And that's why you have multiple stories. It wasn't just one writer. You have Matthew who has a bias, and Luke who has a bias, and Mark, and all of that. And so each of these people and the translators over time, before the canon of scriptures that we have today, that was a much later development also, where they finally agreed upon a canon of scriptures, and we aren't even in agreement now. So it has taken centuries for these concepts. Now, the unfortunate part is that when we talk about them, oftentimes we talk about them, that's where original sin started. And that's really not accurate.
So was the consequence of having to toil for your food and whatnot, was that not part of the original story then, you mean? Or, I mean, so it was a disobedience. I guess I don't get what's the difference really between that and a sin, really.
Where there's a difference between if I break a pot that I carried water in, and I break that pot because of my recklessness, well, the consequence is that I, now I have to carry water somewhere else. It's not because it was a sin to break the pot. It's because the pot is broke. There is a consequence. These concepts of sin and such were developed much later on, to where it became Eve ate the apple, that's why sin entered the world, as opposed to saying, there was a break in a relationship. Was it considered to be a sin? Not at first. That was hundreds of years later when we started to talk about the concept of original sin. And now these concepts, again, we believe as Catholics that the divine will, what God wills for us, that it comes to us in lots of different ways. Remember, it's the sacred scriptures, what's revealed there, science, the world around us, the teaching authority of the church, and the people, our human experience. So as we're putting these things together, is that we come up with the concepts that we have today. For example, again, is there any place in the Bible that speaks of purgatory? Absolutely not. There is no mention of purgatory. Where does purgatory come from? Then where does the concept come from? It comes from in the Pauline literature, where Paul speaks of a cleansing time when we stand before God, because it is God, through the life, death, resurrection of Jesus, is that we are cleansed from our sins, purged, okay? Paul uses those kinds of concepts. Centuries later, we come up with the idea of what purgatory is. Remember, anytime we try to describe these things, even original sin, it's always inadequate. It's a way that we as humans are trying to capture or trying to help each other understand, our relationship with God and God's relationship with us. The same thing when it comes to limbo. We used to talk about limbo all the time. Nobody talks about limbo because it's gotten rid of. We didn't need it anymore. And that's oftentimes what happens, that we had painted ourselves in a corner. We're actually a very creative church that way. We had painted ourselves in a corner, particularly when it came to infants that died shortly after birth. And we didn't know what to do with it, so we come up with a theological construct called limbo. Because we didn't know what else to do with it. We had painted ourselves in the corner of, if you're not baptized, you're toast. No matter what, if you're not baptized, you're toast. Well, these kids weren't baptized. So we as a church couldn't bring ourselves to say this child or infant is going to hell, although we did initially. So what we had to do is we had to come up with something. And we did. Came up with a theological construct called limbo. We don't talk about that anymore because we have a different, our understanding of God and God's relationship with us and ours to God has changed. The same thing with original sin or the concepts like that. I am not saying that original sin doesn't exist. We as a church says yes, but remember it's always inadequately described. You know, we can never fully describe, you know, what it means, and we can only use human terms and human concepts. And so we have this sense that at some point in our origins is that sin entered the world. And because sin entered the world, its effect is still having an effect in our lives today. That no matter how innocent a child is, when the child is born, is that child is affected by the world that is surrounded with from the very moment of conception. So we would say, and why would we say that? For example, we talk about fetal alcohol syndrome. Where does it come from? Not because the kid was binge drinking, you know, it's because of what happens when people do when they're pregnant. We talk about the consequences of our narcotics and what happens when all of this, you know, and you're saying not because, you know, the kid went on a bender someplace and was shooting up. It's because the world in which we live is not always nice. And there's a lot of sin in it. And we are touched by that from the very beginning. And so the concept of baptism then says that through the grace and the love and life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, is that we are able to be freed from that. And so it's some of those balances. So that's when we're talking about, you know, the issues of the Genesis story and such, is that we have to be careful not to plug into the story concepts that we have grown up with that were developed hundreds of years later. Now, did we get, again, as I mentioned, did we get those out of a vacuum? No. No, we go back to scriptures and we say, what were the wise people putting these stories together? What were they trying to tell us? One of the things that I try to help people understand, or when I say, whenever you read the Bible, don't just look at the words, okay? Because words can be sometimes, imagine this, misleading. One of the questions you ask yourself is, when reading anything in the Bible, ask yourself the question, what is this trying to teach me? These books were put together so that they could be read by people hundreds, if not thousands of years in the future. And they wanted people to remember what they had learned over literally thousands of years in their relationship with God. Ask yourself, what is this scripture trying to teach me? Not just what the words say. And so when you read Genesis, ask yourself, what is Genesis trying to teach me? The story of the creation story, the story of Noah, the story of Cain and Abel. What is this trying to teach me? And an example would be in the creation story, one of the things trying to be taught would be what absolutely everything that God has created or ever could possibly create, everything, no exceptions, no conditions, well, maybe the mosquito, but no exceptions and no conditions, everything that God creates is good. Everything.
except loneliness, right? He said it's not good.
Well, but even-
First question is, what's good, right? I mean, how do you
Yeah,
define
but
good?
even loneliness is that even, as we know it, understand it, even loneliness can lead to more creation. Think about it, is that it's like, gosh, and I don't, loneliness. And what it led to another form of creation in God's image. It is that, and that is not, that is not exactly, that is something I should say that is still hard for people to grasp to this day. That everything God creates, has created, is good. What we do with it can really twist it.
And that's what a lot of these stories in Genesis are about. People failing to see the goodness of God in the world, in others, in what he has created. And so that's why and we'll talk about tonight. I mean, Adam and Eve screwed up. Noah's sons, they screwed up. That's this failure to recognize the goodness of God.
So Father, I'm jumping out of my seat here, okay? I agree with you 100%. However, in the ears of most Protestants and quite frankly, most Catholics, you would be a heretic.
I know that.
So here's the problem.
Sure.
I'm looking around this table and there are looks on people's faces. Like this is the first time they've heard any of this. So the travesty is the church has a serious problem. Faith formation classes and from the pulpit, they've lied to people all these years. In other words, they're teaching a biblical literalist, Protestant evangelical fundamentalist approach to the Bible. And they still are from the pulpit. I know clerics, Father, that I've met with, and you know what they told me? That's because it's all true. They've been so poorly catechized that you are the first person I've ever heard say this stuff. And I bet you all these people will say the same thing. So the church across the board, and even in faith formation, they lie to the kids because they're telling Adam and Eve.
Kindergarten on, yep.
Oh, no.
There's a
Religious,
snake,
religious
there's a
educators,
block,
religious educators have said, you need to tell me everything I've learned so far is wrong. That's because they've all been lied to. The church lies to everybody. And I'm telling you, unless this can be fixed, people are going to leave in droves because you know what? They're going to go home to their scientifically minded parents and they're going to say, my religious educator told me this. And the parents are going to say, you're nuts. These are fables. These are myths. And they're right. But the church won't admit to it.
Well, I think there's a difference between, first of all, I think that you are correct in the sense that we have done a very poor job. Well, I will have to stand before God and answer to that. I think that it's not so much is lying as much as, I think people really struggling with this because of the way it has been presented. Now, in the beginning, I should say, that it certainly was because of a lack of understanding. It wasn't until the 30s and 40s that, 1930s, 1940s, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Right.
that we had always believed, or many had always believed that, these scriptures that we had written down, whether it was the St. James Bible or lots of others, that this was exactly the way God had whispered it in the ear. And then we find these, literally, I think by the grace and by the providence of God, we find these, what are called and referred to as the Dead Sea Scrolls. We find these scrolls that were written literally hundreds, if not thousands of years before the Bibles that we are presently using, and saying, wait a minute, this is different. This is really different. And we began, and this was one of the reasons with the whole Second Council and what led up to the Second Council,
Right.
is that recognizing the very thing that you have mentioned, that, that our approach in many ways was in terrible error. Not necessarily even because of ill will, but just lack of knowledge, ignorance in the best sense of the term, lack of knowledge.
Right.
And as a consequence, we taught in a way, and how do you turn around teaching that has been done for hundreds and hundreds of years?
Right.
That's
But here's the deal. The Verbum, right, in
Right.
Vatican II says, they mandate, here's how you teach the Bible. 70 years have passed and the church has done nothing about it.
You know, one of my professors in graduate school said it takes 100 years for a council to fully become into effect. And I think that's true because we're only 50 some years
But
in.
Hannah, we're in a desperate position here with people leaving the church in droves.
True, but if I can interrupt,
Sure,
the Lutherans believe, the Methodists, Presbyterians believe every word,
absolutely.
and they are not losing people either.
They're
So
losing
I-
in droves. They're all going to
Well, then-
non-denominational churches.
Which are only keeping them for an average of 10 years. And then they're
And that's
going back to some home parish.
Great.
They're not keeping them.
This is a great conversation, by the way. I mean, this really is a great conversation because it gets to the heart of the problem that we're all in. And that is our children are being poorly formed because they're being taught things that are absolutely untrue.
Well, I don't know that I would go that far. As the
I
director
don't
of this marriage,
No, and I'm not picking on you personally. I'm picking on what comes down from the archdiocese that you're mandated to teach. That's a problem. I've been in touch with the top faith formation guys in the archdiocese saying we need to come up with a program that will re-energize parents to learn to teach the Bible with their children in its proper context. And they said, Ron, it's a great idea, but we got so many other bigger fish to fry.
yeah.
We're not going to be able to get to it probably for how long. And in the meantime, you go on and on and on. I mean, I sat through one where the story of Jonah, okay? The religious educator was teaching that was a factual historical event. And I just about threw up, okay? And I really did because I'm thinking these kids are going like this. They're rolling their eyes, all right? Because it couldn't be any, it was never meant to, you open your Bible and read the introduction to the story of Jonah. And what does it say? It says it's a fable with a didactic lesson to teach about God's mercy for somebody who's willing to repent. Even the Assyrians who slaughtered 10 out of the 12 tribes of Israel and never came back. So, but we're teaching it as if it was a real story. That's damaging to our kids.
But, you know, and I get that. I think that would be another time for gathering. But I want to get back to what we're talking here, which really connects with a lot of the conversation that we've had. It's just recognizing that, and you know, Jesus had 12. We got how many around this table? Yeah, I think that we have to be willing and able to say, you know what, and to speak up at different times, not because you're scripture scholars or whatever, is that you're not expected to be scripture scholars. But we can at times, you know, take some of that which we have learned and saying, you know what, I think there's a different approach we could also use. We don't need to stand up and throw a book at someone and saying, you lying heretic, may you rot in hell, as much as being able to say, you know, good lying heretic, you're going to rot. No,
I'm gonna have to change my way.
yeah, yeah. It's recognizing though that, and I guess starting here with this group of saying, the Bible and what it can teach us, even something as small as the book of Genesis, it can teach us so much more if we allow ourselves to step back. And again, I go back and I may have shared this with you that one of my first scripture professors said, I need to break down what you think you know about the Bible. I need to break that all down so that we can take what is out there and the scholarship and knowledge that we have. Again, people very much inspired. Not to say that what the Bible is teaching us is all false and heresy and lies, as much as saying it's so much bigger than that. And that to begin to know, and maybe this is something that Hannah has to do for a group like yourself, is that we jump into some time of going into some church history. You know, there's a lot about church history that we don't know. And we did some pretty nutsy stuff as a church, you know, in centuries. We think people, religious fanatics, do nutsy stuff today. They've got nothing on us. You know, we just didn't have planes to do it. If we had, we would have destroyed even more. Is that we, you know, going and who is it? Lindsay, a lot of times goes back to, we need to go back to, you know, Church 101 and start talking about some history because it's so much bigger and there is so much we can learn, not only about concepts like original sin and such. These are important things to our faith tradition, terribly important. They just aren't necessarily as cut and dried as a lot of times they have been made to appear. And so as we continue to embrace them, is that I believe we can embrace some of these things about the goodness of creation, about the goodness of everything we are and what we are about. That if we can begin to that, we can then, I believe, start to address some of the big problems in our world of saying there is no such thing as someone who was created evil.
Right.
That whether it's people of color, people with transgender, people with gender issues, gay, straight, everyone, is that we are all, every single one of us, created in God's image. Now, if we were to approach each other with that no matter who I encounter, that they are created in God's image, that would have me step off, rather than judging them because they don't meet my rules or even our church's rules, is that to be able to say, let's start first with what Genesis teaches us. All are created in God's image. Men and women are created in God's image. When's the last time you got up in the morning and you looked in the mirror and you said to yourself, dang, God does good work. Does a real good work, and yet we don't do that. And because one, we were oftentimes told that if you did that, that was arrogance or pride. It has nothing to do with arrogance or pride. I mean, the arrogance and pride are certainly sins, we get that. But to be able to see in yourself the image of God, there is nothing sinful about that.
I think that's a form of showing praise to God.
To God. And we have a long ways to go with that. But it can start.
Can I make one more comment about it? Just launching up. And I thought about this for a long time. There's like way more than 100 million sperm that have an opportunity to fertilize. More than 100 million. So each sperm united with the egg carries with it a set of actions that God knows beforehand what you're going to do. So none of us here are an accident. God specifically directed that single sperm to fertilize your mother's egg because he knew everything you'd ever do during your entire life on earth. That goes for Hitler, that goes for Judas, it goes for everybody. He wanted your life, your free will actions as a critical role in his grand plan of salvation history. So everything you do, he's already known about, what you're going to do, what you have done, okay, good or bad. But all of those free will actions play a critical role in his overall plan. You say, how could Hitler? Don't forget, Hitler was one out of 100 million sperm that packaged Hitler's evil deeds. God doesn't create evil, but he knows what Hitler was going to do because it actually plays a role. Judas took Jesus to the cross. Did God have a plan B? Without Judas, how would Jesus have gone to the cross? He needed Judas, so he created Judas. The Blessed Virgin Mary was created without sin before she was conceived. So how would that have worked? He knew ahead of time from all eternity, the Blessed Virgin Mary was going to be the mother of God. So this is beautiful stuff,
I would say that that's one approach that you have. I would tend to take a different approach.
Sure.
But that's again part of the discussion of what it means to be created by God in God's image and to be part of the world in which we live. So I think we need to go back then to Genesis. Thank you for the question. I'll never talk to you again. No, thank you. No, thank you for the question. It helps us, I think, to be able to look at what do we need to be talking about in the future. There are just lots of questions and issues that we need to, to center on saying, wow, this is so much bigger than I imagined. And it can just start with a simple question. And
tonight we're starting with Cain and Abel.
We are.
Yes, we are.
Yes.
Okay,
We are.
go for it, Tana.
Okay, so, we kind of left off here last week. So Cain and Abel, It's just kind of this, pretty much what's contained in chapter 4 of Genesis.
Yep.
Maybe we should kind of summarize so that we can kind of move ahead. So some of you may be familiar with this story. Cain and Abel both, Abel brings an offering to the Lord, and the Lord favor on Abel for bringing this offering, but on Cain's offering he did not look with favor, and the Lord wonders why Cain is so angry, and Cain tells Abel to go out into the field, and Cain kills Abel in the field, and then vanished and goes into the wilderness. And wilderness, the term wilderness is very common in the Old Testament, particularly in Genesis. And then after this whole episode, which is, this whole thing is very vastly different in Children of Eden, but it's very, it makes it more entertaining to watch. So you'll have to watch for that in the play or in the musical. And so it kind of then gets into the generations.
Well, before that, I guess I just want to point out that at the end of chapter 4, God pretty much says, yeah, he did a bad thing, but no one should hurt him. And I think that's really interesting, personally. Go ahead.
And this is where, remember that these stories were around a long time, and you have the writers of these stories and these traditions that were passed down for hundreds and hundreds of years, is that by the time that this would have been written down, is that there was already a rule against blood vengeance, okay? Is that goes back a long ways, that blood vengeance was no longer acceptable. And even when it came to, the whole concept of blood vengeance, you steal my cow, I go in and burn your city or your village down, killing every man, woman, and child that I can find. Well, that's why even when they talk about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, that was finding balance, saying, if I kill your cow, you can't come in and burn my houses down. You can get a cow, or maybe two, but you can't come in and burn everything down. So this concept of blood vengeance against Cain, that the mark of Cain is a person inserting what they have come to know and live by, no longer blood vengeance, inserting that into the story when it most likely was never originally there. And so it says, okay, we're not going to have you just basically take it out and anybody can take a free shot at you. Mm-hmm. Is that, are there consequences? Again, it goes back to the consequences of our actions. This is also the first time where we begin to hear the sense of sin comes into play, and not in the garden, Cain and Abel, where blood vengeance, is basically, people are reminded that no blood vengeance, because there was a mark upon Cain. Nobody messes with Cain. If you mess with Cain, you mess with God. And so, because blood vengeance was no longer acceptable. So those are the kinds of things that at times the reality of the person's life writing this down is inserted in the creation story, because otherwise it would have been a free-for-all.
Yeah, the Bible's full of that.
Oh,
they're
absolutely.
called anachronisms, right?
Yeah.
In other words, it's something that exists in the author's day that didn't exist in the period that, and so he retrojects it back into that period. The Bible's full of that.
It's a way to maintain the the civilization, the being able to maintain the order, otherwise, literally, it would have simply it would have given permission for free for all.
Right.
And so these are put back in there.
So you got Adam, Eve, right? You got Cain and Abel. Abel's gone. You got three people. Who's going to kill Cain, and where do you get his wife? I mean, these are the questions that come out immediately, right?
In the land of Nod, where he
So where did she come from?
in the east side of Eden. East side of Eden somewhere.
The other thing you look at is that the Adam and Eve story is paralleled by the Cain and Abel story. They're almost parallel of the Adam and Eve experience, and what God doesn't destroy Adam and Eve. Is there a consequence to their action? Yes. But he doesn't destroy them. God loves his children. That comes out, in the children of Eden.
Yeah.
God loves what he created. It was created good. And so once, okay, Adam and Eve mess up and, with the fruit and all that, is that you have a parallel now with the Cain and Abel story. And one of the themes within the Pentateuch is that we keep sinning. But one of the themes also in the 5 books, the Pentateuch, one of the themes, remember, it's a whole, the Pentateuch is a whole. It's not just 5 books that happen to be together because they didn't know what else to do when they were setting up the shelves on their library. Is that it's a whole, and it was planned as a whole. And so there are 10 major themes that go through the Pentateuch. But 2 of the major themes are we keep sinning, and the other one is God keeps forgiving. And those 2 of those basic of the 10 themes are constant, whether it's Moses or Abraham or whatever it might be, or in any one of the books, the Pentateuch books. I should say the 5 books of the Pentateuch.
Very nice.
God keeps forgiving.
I need to be reborn again.
Why is that?
I said 87, Mrs.
Isn't it wonderful to find out? Now remember, it's not that everything else was simply bad or wrong. For some, in circumstances, sometimes we screwed up. I mean, let's make no mistake, sometimes we screwed up. But the fact is that there were a lot of good people who really thought and believed that everything in there was exactly as it was. There were a lot of good people. That's what they were taught, and that's what the others were taught. And the fact is that because it was taught doesn't necessarily make it accurate. It means it was taught. And it did a lot of good for people. But I think that as with better scholarship in what we know today, we are able to do better, much better, when it comes to the sacred scriptures and what we can learn from that. That if you read a text and it strikes your heart in a particular way, you're not sinning because you've experienced something holy and sacred. Is that and unfortunately, and we are a church that is made up of weak and sinful human beings, no matter what hat you wear or what fancy robes you wear. We are weak and sinful human beings. And that means there's always going to be some of that sin that's in there. But the fact is that we can do better. We can do better for lots of different reasons. I find it, because growing up, I was right there with you. I mean, say, hey, Samson and David and Goliath and Adam and Eve, I'd say, hey, Adam, how you doing, Eve? Probably didn't, enter my mind, where the other people came from. Anyway, not at first until I reached puberty. You look at all of these things and saying, I was right there with you. But what I have found in many ways, that when we begin to kind of open our eyes to a new way of looking at things, and to be able to use what we know today is that it can be so much more free. And it can open, it can sometimes break out of those narrow boxes that oftentimes we live with. And how many of us at one point, in a sense, thought that anyone who wasn't Catholic was going to go to hell? We believed that. Well,
Yeah,
well, exactly.
that's right.
It's not because we were bad people, it's what we believed at that time. But the fact is that as we begin to learn and as we begin to grow in understanding, we are able to recognize those folks aren't going to hell. And just because a person is not Catholic, they're not going to hell. And because, well, if they're Lutheran, they will. But it's recognizing that by growing in these things, it can be so much more free. Just it can be free in so many ways of how I experience God, what I believe about God. There are times, when I think about reading some of the stuff that God would get in a real snit and pretty doggone ornery once in a while. It's like, get a grip, guy. I mean, that's the way you created us. It's not our fault. And it's recognizing, though, that when you begin to see the bigness of God, you can begin to experience the scriptures, prayer, so many things in marvelous, marvelous ways. It's like being able to breathe after having something sitting on your chest for a long time and being able to take a deep breath like never before.
I think it helps you, at least for me, it's helped me to realize how truly good God really is and to get away from some of this, well, the snake was the devil and all of this kind of thing, and just look for the beauty of God in your life.
Now, and there are those who think, well, you're just looking for an easy way to sin. No, that's a misunderstanding too. I am not looking for easy ways to get around the rules, you might say. But think about when we go back, when I mentioned this, when we look at something like the 10 Commandments. If we didn't look at those as simply as laws, because usually if there's ever a law, and when you think about why are laws made? Because somebody screwed up or maybe found a way around some other law. And so we make another law, and then we make another law, and then we make another law. As opposed to being able to approach the 10 Commandments as the 10 words translated from the Hebrew, and looking at this and saying, if you want to be part of our community, imagine we as Catholics were to say this to people who wanted to join our community. What is it like to be Catholic? What do you mean to be Catholic? And we could throw at them the catechism. A lot of good stuff there. I think it's a little overdone, but nonetheless, it's a lot of good stuff there. But if we were to say to a person who wanted to join Holy Angels community, here are the Holy Angels. We only worship one God, only one, no other God. Money is not a God, power is not a God, ego is not a God. We worship one God, no tree gods, no pew gods, no chair gods, we worship one God, the God of all. We don't make any kind of false images. We don't have our golden calves or whatever, because we worship one God. We gather to pray on a regular basis. Why? Because we worship one God. And we gather to worship on a regular basis and keep holy and sacred that day, because that God is so good to us that we want to take a day where we don't have to work and all of that stuff, and we can just center on how good God is. We honor our parents. We honor our ancestors. Why? Not because they're perfect, just in case you were wondering. Not because, but because we believe there is a wisdom there that they have something to teach us. Imagine if we were to approach people that way when they approached us, rather than saying, okay, church on Sunday or it's a mortal sin. Don't eat before 1 hour before Mass or it's a mortal sin. Don't have a bad thought or it's a mortal sin. Don't do this because, and we can hand them rules and regulations. And I am not saying we throw it all out to have anarchy. I am saying, though, imagine if we refocused and we didn't start with all sorts of rules and regulations.
It's all in the marketing.
Some ways. But imagine if the marketing was better.
Right, exactly.
And that we were able to say, I would have no doubts that people would be busting down the doors to get into this church. Not because I'm that good or anybody else for that matter, but because we as a community are literally do believe no matter who you are welcome. No matter who you are. You are welcome here, no matter what. I don't care, saint, sinner, everything, anyone, anything, or what between. You are welcome here. And we treated that people that way. Whether Catholic or not, you are welcome. That the first thing we didn't do was saying, okay, you're welcome here, and then hand them a missalette that has the rules of what you can or can't do. We become so caught up with the rules and regulations. We can't. That we forget. And this is exactly what Jesus thought about. What's interesting is that literally less than 100 years after Jesus taught, don't call anyone father, don't have a hierarchy, don't put people in charge of each other. Less than 100 years, we built a whole system that was contrary to what he said. So it's that kind of thing that can be incredibly freeing. Again, depending on how we approach it. Yeah, God is incredibly good.
So he's so good, he let Cain off to the land of Nod.
Yeah.
And now we're going to look at the generations, but instead of reading generations, we're going to listen to a song from the show, but your phone might be locked, so you might have to come with me.
Give me another chance to talk. I think that, one of the things that we ought to do is that as we gather around here, and it's really neat to have some of these conversations. It is great to have some of these conversations. I have a lot more conversations and lots of things that sometimes are taboo to talk about. And I think we need to talk about it. But to be able to write down and say, what are those questions that you have? What are those things, whether it's about, sometimes the way our church has taught or the history of our church, sometimes how our church, approached human sexuality and who we are as persons in relationships. So I'll be quiet now. I think Hannah plays the bongos in the show.
The song I played Marcos.
Generations of some by river, all over, spread the people all over the earth. Spread the people all over the wide world. Generation, creation, all the nations, multiplication, bigger, 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 bigger time. Generations of man. Helping with the cattle and the cotton. Generations of man. Generations of creation. Generations of man. Generations of Came and a wife on the east side of Eden. Generations of He did a little love and did a little freedom. Generations of King that Ira and Baby child. And they come from Mr. Methuselah. The sheep of Jabal, flock of Jubal, brass and iron from the children of Judah. Multiplication, watching to badly, ocean to play. Bigger, 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 bigger time. Generations of man. Helping with the cattle and the cotton. Generations of multiplication, generations of generations of the He got to be there, but I don't listen to. Hey, Mark, what's up?
Alright, so that was Generations. That's the first song in Act 2. It's kind of, I think the best way they could have done that was with the song, otherwise you would just be standing up there reading
The list is read.
the book, right? So it's really neat the way that's all sewn together, I think. Moving on to,
Just one
Oh,
thing,
go ahead.
generation, not just, the reason why generations is so important is that you needed to be able to take your line so it would be unbroken. That's why it was so important to have sons. Obviously, a very patristic society. It was so important because that would then connect you literally for this generations of Adam. It would connect you back to Adam. It would connect you back to the Garden of Eden. And that was important, that when you died, is that then you might say, then you had that cord that would, kind of keep you connected. And then you had to have plenty of sons in order to make sure that you had, your name would live on in the future. If it didn't, in a sense, it meant that you were no more. It's not just that you did. Your family, your line, your heritage, it was no more. And that means you would cease to exist, as if somehow, even before God's eyes, you were gone. You ceased to exist. It was their concepts of how we stayed connected to the God who created us. And so why it was so important to be able to have all of those generations out, whether they were accurate or not, wasn't important, is that we were able to fill in the blanks sometimes. They were very creative people. Our obsession is facts and figures and all of that stuff.
But then, so that's why Abraham and Sarah had to have a child.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. The child he had with Tamar, wasn't going to do it. No, Hagar. Hagar. Wasn't going to do it. He had to have his own. That's why it was so important when, with the story of, sacrificing his son. It wasn't about losing his son. That would have been bad enough. It was about you ended, your heritage ended, your very existence. It's like it would be even erased from God's mind. That's why you had to have a child, and why it was so important, that when God stayed, Abraham's hand, it's like, whew, now I know when I am laid to rest, I will have somebody carry my name on and my heritage, and I will always remain before God's eye.
Can I make a quick comment on the generations? Genesis 4 and 5. Genesis 4 is a Palestinian origin. Genesis 5 is a Mesopotamian origin. If you guys look, the same names are in both lists, okay? One is the line of Cain, but includes the same people that are in the line of Seth in chapter 5. The difference is that one of the sons of Lamech in chapter 4 is Tubal-Cain, and he was the founder of bronze and iron. Well, that's an anachronism because the author who wrote that, bronze and iron wouldn't be discovered and created for thousands of years down the road, but he just put that iron back in chapter 4. Chapter 5 is a word-for-word translation of the Babylonian king list. It goes right down the line. So it's 1,000 years before the biblical list in chapter 5. And the thing that's really cool is the person in position 7 is Enoch. He lived 365 days or years, which is a solar year, and then he walked away with God. Well, in the Babylonian king list, the guy's name is Edamanke, and he was the special son of Shamash, the sun god, who's also the solar, okay? And he was taken up to heaven. So what the biblical author did is he took almost word for word translation of the Babylonian king list, and he made up his genealogy for Noah, basically is what he did. Does that make sense, Father?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Okay, going on that just a little bit. When in the Old Testament do we actually start with names that probably were legit?
I mean,
Go ahead, Father. I got a comment. Go ahead.
I mean, none of these names probably existed because they were written, hundreds of years ago, 1,000
Okay.
years ago. But when does it catch up besides the New Testament? I mean,
Well, we know
Abraham-
Jesus existed.
well, that's why I said the
They're
Old Testament.
beside the New Testament.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I mean, like Abraham, was there an Abraham per se?
There may have been.
Well, Adam
Well-
is taken from Adamah, from the earth.
Yeah.
So,
That's what we have called this original man and Eve.
right,
because of-
so there's,
But
there's,
No, I was just gonna say that, when it
I
comes
want to see
to,
how he answers this.
well, Abraham, is that they had to write the story so it made sense.
Correct.
Okay,
I-
so,
Right.
and also the other piece is that when you look at the Bible is a book of faith. That is its primary purpose, not a book of facts. Are there facts in it? Yes, there are. Is there poetry? Yes, there is. Is there all sorts of literature? The primary purpose of the Bible is to help a person grow in faith. So when you look at a lot of these, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and all of that, were they sons? Maybe. Were they contemporaries and at the same time? Maybe. Don't really know, because again, the oral tradition.
Yeah.
So when you start really looking at, where are some of the names of it, would basically be around sometime of David and Solomon. Why? Because again, there was a time of peace. David has now united the kingdoms. So you have Saul and David and those people. So these were now legitimate kingdoms recognized by kingdoms around the world at that time. What we fail to realize is that with David and Solomon, the kingdom of Israel was one of the major military powers and economic powers in the world. I mean, we fail to realize that sometimes. And how did they do that? By having basically being able to control all the trade routes to the Mediterranean from the east, Assyria, Babylonia, all of those areas. They controlled the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean, which then went to the west. So they were a mega super economic and military power. As a consequence of that, now you have records in other kingdoms of going to saying, I'm from Babylonia, and I gotta go and deal with this, with the king of Israel, who is David, and then and also you have the records from that actual time, okay? So we would probably say a lot of this would be more around 500-600 years or so before Christ, because that was the time when David finally united. It would be 6 to 7. That's when David united the kingdom, and later on. And see, the other piece to this also would be is that during the time of the exile in the 580s, is that now you have Nebuchadnezzar, and you have the Babylonians, Assyrians, and all that. You have them battling the kings of Israel, and it's now in their records. That's how we learn some of this stuff. Anything really before, a lot of that before that, but see, that wasn't important. The details were not important to them. What was important was the concept, was what was being taught, was the relationship with God and how we stayed connected to that.
Speaking of details not being important, one flood story has one number of animals should be coming, and one flood
Yeah.
story has another. So go, Hannah.
yeah, so one thing I wanna say, just in case I don't have time to say it, is that kind of going, well.
This was great, though.
But-
I mean,
This was awesome.
This was
Um,
awesome today.
And then, let me
So we just add another week.
just real quick, guys. You understand enough? I won't, if I'm bothering you. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. I won't, I'll say it later.
So kind of going, so we kind of talked about last week how these stories of, we looked at Father's books of all those stories of creation. There's 68 different stories about floods in different languages throughout the world. And the one that we are looking at in the Bible is taken from the Babylonian literature Gilgamesh, which we kind of talked about last week. And in the story of Gilgamesh, there's a figure like Noah. His name is Utnapishtim. And
Say that 3 times.
yeah. And he wants to, there's a flood, but he wants to build an ark and survive alone with no one with him. Noah obviously doesn't do that. He wants to try and fill up the ark. And so even though I just want to kind of drive home the point that even though there's all these other stories and we want to kind of they wanted to write them down, this goodness of God comes through in these stories from the Bible, whereas that's not so much the case in this story of Gilgamesh, because it's, it's focused on the self, and we don't, that's not what comes through in our flood story. So I just thought that was important. But kind of before we get into the flood, like Lindsay was saying, I think it's important to know that there are 2 authors actually of this flood. And it's interesting once you read it and break it up, you can really see and tell like what these authors, what their motives are and things. So the J source, the Yahweh source, which we have talked about, this is in Genesis 7, verse, like in the beginning of Genesis chapter 7, the Lord says to Noah to take 7 pairs of animals, a male and a female, just 7 pairs. Whereas, sorry, whereas I thought that was mine. Whereas in Genesis 6, you see, of all living creatures, bring 2 of each kind, male and female. So those are 2 differences, and that's from the P source, the priestly source. And so that's a huge example of the 2 writers, and it shows the editing nature of the Bible, because usually when we tell the story, especially to kids, 2 by 2, every animal, but the J source said only 7 pairs, so that's interesting. Another big difference between the 2, typically we say 40 days and 40 nights, right? It was the flood, and that's the J source that says 40 days and 40 nights. The P source says 150 days water swelled on the earth, and then God remembered Noah and the animals.
Oh, he forgot about him? Is that what you're saying?
And so that's at the end of chapter 7, the beginning of chapter 8, that's the P source. And when the waters had swelled on the earth for 150 days, God remembered Noah and all the animals, wild and tame, that were with him in the ark. So he made a wind sweep over the earth, and the waters began to subside. So there's another big example. One more is that we were talking about this today. In Genesis 8, verse 6, it talks about Noah releasing a raven first. And he released a raven. It flew back and forth until the waters dried from the earth. Then he released the dove. So that's in the J source. In the P source, there's no dove, no raven, no birds of any kind, which is another huge, there are things that we associate with the flood. All of the animals, 2 by 2, 40 days and 40 nights, the dove, and these are all from 2 different writers. So we just kind of wanted to touch on that before we got into the story.
It's really, there are so many things that we find in here. Remember, as I mentioned last week, the folks during this writing all of this, putting it together, they had no problem with the contradictions, none whatsoever. Their concern was, how do we teach the people about the relationship with God and what God has done? For the Yahwist and the priestly writers, particularly the priestly, absolute unity with God was essential. And so everything they write about is always about how we worship God and how we give thanks to God. The Yahwists had a different approach. But see, they had no difficulty with the contradiction. And so many of these, literally the stories that we have come to know and appreciate are bits and pieces of numerous stories. There's another story, ancient story, of a raven. Now this is one big honk on raven, is that it's the raven who flies back and forth on the earth that with its wings dries off the earth. So they are pulling from all sorts of things. And that's the beauty of it, is that they were able to, to express what they believed about God and God's connection to us. They were able to do that with the marvelous narratives that they put together here. So it's just, again, it's a wonderful way to be able to see that and the ways that God has.
Can I speak a comment now? You mind? Just make a comment. You guys should read chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. It deals with the angel marriages. The angels came down and mated with human women and had the Nephilim, which were the superhumans. And the breach between the divine and the human was the reason that the flood took place. And there was all kinds of controversy around that, but that's the preface to the flood itself, the angel marriages.
Right.
So we were a little annoyed the males had to come down from heaven and mate with the females who were on earth. What's that all about? Why aren't females coming down from heaven? Okay, anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. So we also see a difference in the J and the P. So in the J, the flood is caused by 40 days of rain. That's a very natural consequence. I mean, we see that here on Earth today. In P, the flood is not caused by rain. It's caused by a firmament. So in Genesis 1, we see this firmament, which is like another term for heaven. And fountains of water are coming out of this firmament and the flood occurs. So this is kind of more of a supernatural cause for the flood. And really speaks more of, this is a new creation that's taking place, a renewal. I think every time we read the story of Noah, we can think of opportunities for renewal in our own lives. I mean, that's kind of natural. Flood strikes in people.
Father, was it a whole flood on the whole entire world?
Again, no, there is no geological proof. And again, we as a church, for the most part, except with Galileo and a few others, but we generally do believe in science and what science has to teach us. In fact, it's one of the ways we believe that God reveals the divine will through science and nature and all of that. There is no geological study that has ever shown, by all the great minds over the centuries, that has ever shown that there was any kind of catastrophic flood where the entire planet was covered in water. There is just no evidence of anything like that happening. So if that doesn't happen, what are possibilities? Well, there are a number of possibilities. Not that there wasn't a flood, it just wasn't, let's just say people's worlds were a whole lot smaller than we know the world to be. We look at it, they would have believed that the world was flat. So there were in the town, around the areas, Ararat and a few other places, but they called highland seas of water, literally, that were from the great glaciers and that formed as the world was literally forming and all of those things. if one of these great island seas, if one of the walls broke, and there is evidence that this has happened, it would literally, anything below it, now you're talking about a small ocean, okay? We're not talking about a water puddle here. You're talking like Lake Michigan. Well, that would be a good example. Lake Michigan. You know, coming out of, if you are familiar with 94, coming out of west, out of Milwaukee. Okay, when you're coming west and you are facing west, on the left-hand side is this very large kind of, not a water tower like you
Yeah.
normally see, but almost looks like a, what,
Oh, in Tosa.
yeah, it looks like it looks more like what's Gru and the no, it's a cartoon character. No,
Yeah.
neither. Okay, it's basically a fat, squat water tower. That water tower marks where the shore of Lake Michigan used to be. Okay, be an inland sea, and the shore was where that water tower was. If you notice, 94 keeps going up and up and up as you leave Milwaukee.
Yep.
That was the shore of the inland sea. Now, where did it go? Well, what it did is that for lots of reasons and the glaciers and such, the south end of that inland sea burst, and that's why you have all of that soil and the flatlands in Indiana and Illinois, and because all of the silt and garbage, it basically rushed to the south and flattened everything out. Okay?
Quite bad.
Yeah, what's that?
Indiana's our garbage.
Yeah, Indiana's kind of our garbage. So what you have left of that inland sea is the 5 Great Lakes. Okay. That all used to be one huge inland sea. And this escarpment is what it's called. This shoreline goes all the way through north to Fond du Lac and follows all the way through Kettle Moraine. And you could literally follow this shoreline that this inland sea would have covered. All right. Now, think about that, is that now you have a person, you know, Joe Schmo leaves his village to go trade with a village, you know, maybe 100 miles or so over mountains or whatever to go trade, you know, his cheese wheel. He comes back after months of trading to bring back, and he hits the crest of a mountain or whatever, and all he sees is water. Now, why do we know that something like this happened? Because a number of different water areas in Northern Europe and that whole area there is that they have been searching for where would the villages have been. Where did they find the villages? 30 to 50 feet below the water line. Now, first of all, we know people are not going to build a house 30 or 50 feet below a water line. But all of the villages, bodies, artifacts, all of these things have been found in villages 30 or 40 feet or more below the water line. So obviously some major flood happened. Now, it is very possible then what you have is not somehow a flood that covered the whole world, because there's no evidence of that. But what you could very well have is a person coming back and literally finding their entire whomever out of existence because they're all dead.
Their world was flooded.
Right.
Their world,
Right.
and now this becomes a story that is told and retold and retold.
And the
And-
fish got bigger
Yeah.
and bigger.
It's yeah. So we say, you know, I caught a fish this big,
Mhm.
you know, and it becomes now a world global flood because that's what they knew. That would have been a global flood for them because their entire world would have been wiped out. But it becomes bigger than that. And there are these stories that have been, again, numerous stories of floods like this. This is a common theme that various cultures and societies would have told these stories. So maybe it never happened anyway where they said it did, but may have happened someplace else. They just used that story. Why? Because it helped to explain the relationship between people and God and why God decided to wipe it all out. And then, so you then have to, but you have to have a cause for it. So you go back to that introductory part and saying, you know, people, it wasn't Adam and Eve, but it was these kind of semi-deities. and we still have those in our own litter, not our own today's litter, but, was Hercules, was the offspring of a god and a human. And you have, all sorts of these heroes and such. Achilles, Perseus, all of these Greek and Roman figures, is that they had to give a reason. Well, you can't just say, well, somebody was bad, so God destroyed the earth. You had to make something so bad that it would really tick God off. And so, again, consequences of our decisions. But God did not destroy everyone. In comes Noah. I was going to say Moses. In comes Noah.
Later.
And so because
And his wife and his son. And their
because
wives.
God couldn't destroy all of the good that he had created. God is a sucker for goodness. And again, that's the point, is that with all the god-awful things in some ways that are there, what does God do? God centers on the good. And we find that again with Lot and Abraham and God bickering or, bartering over, what if I find 50? What if I find 40? What if I find 30? What if I find 20? What if I find 10? And God keeps saying, okay, we'll find it. Okay. It's actually, when you know the bartering system, it's just hilarious. With Abraham and God going back and forth, it's just hilarious. But it says something about this God we believe in.
I mean, the water animals had a good time. I don't think any of them probably died. So.
Well, yeah, there's they talk about kind of favorites there, the whale or the sea monsters, as the scriptures tell us.
I just want to get to as well. You were talking about the bow.
Oh yes, the bow. When it says that he set a bow in the sky, oftentimes we think that means a rainbow, and it is, it has sometimes leanings toward that. What it means to hang a bow in the sky. This goes back again to some of the other stories of Gilgamesh and stories of ancient tribes, ancient tribal stories, civilizations. When a warrior finally had defeated his enemy, this goes back to the ancient stories of the titanic battles between good and evil. The giants, you might say, the Titans, in Greek and Roman mythology and stuff, is that when the battle for the soul, you may say, for the entire earth, for the good and bad of the earth, when that battle is finally won, or in any kind of war, when the battle is finally won and the enemy is defeated, a sign of that is when the king or the leader takes his bow and arrow, takes his bow, hangs it up on the wall above the hearth of his castle, because now that is a symbol of peace. Evil has been defeated. So when it talks about God hanging his bow in the sky as a reminder, that's the image that they're talking about. God is hanging his bow and arrow, the bow of his bow and arrow is hanging it up on the divine wall of the skies in order that it might be a symbol of peace, that the evil has finally been defeated.
And hope for the future.
And
too.
yes, and it brings hope for the future. Those are the kinds of things that, the images that it's often God didn't create a rainbow because he liked pretty colors. The image really is of the bow and his arrows, the quiver would be hung on the wall. It was
Very interesting. I wouldn't think of that.
Yeah, I mean, you three. But man, we don't have time for all of this. And with this, great, if we could continue and then go into Exodus and,
Maria wants to study the whole entire Bible.
oh,
Ready for
I mean,
that, Father?
I just think there is so much, and I'm so grateful that we have the people here, especially you three, who are willing
It's them.
to
I just
open it up
pretend.
and to show the rest of us, because I think, unfortunately, everybody who was born pre-Vatican II, right? This is how we grew up because it was easy for the nuns in the schools to teach it. You know, it was much easier to talk about Adam and Eve and the snake, original
That's
sin
right.
and move on. It was easy to talk about Noah and the pretty little rainbow afterwards. And, it was so easy because how do you possibly get into little kids this that we are now learning, this whole theory about,
But that's probably also what they knew,
Well, that's
as you
true.
learn
That's
more.
true.
So it's
Yeah.
all,
And remember, there was a comment made before that. There are those who would believe that what I am telling you
Would be.
and what Hannah and Lindsay, we espouse is that we are flaming heretics. That we are putting hell in the handbasket and that somehow we are no longer believers and we ought to be thrown out of the church. What we are sharing with you is in the spirit of the Second Council, which we have a long ways to go with that, is based on and rooted in some of the latest and the best.
Biblical scholarship.
Yeah, that's out there. I mean, these are the giants of people that have studied this stuff their entire life and have looked at this. Yes, are there those who believe, literally what's in this book? Yes, there are. Am I going to call them, Satan dogs? Of course not. I am going to respectfully disagree with them and such. But I believe there are lots of different ways we get to the kingdom. But I also believe that as Catholics, we are not literalists. And I think that that's something that, we went through that phase, but then when you've been around for a few thousand years, you kind of go through phases, but we're not literalists. And I strongly resist those who try to make us literalists again. I just believe that we head down a very dangerous path when you go to literalism, as opposed to asking yourself the question, what is this trying to teach me? What can I learn when I read these marvelous stories? When I read, and the factual things in here, when I read about, all of this stuff, what do I believe these people were trying to teach me when they put this together? Because they wanted to pass this on because of the wisdom in regard to the relationship they had with their God. We could all write our own Bible. We just have to make sure that it was around long enough, for a few thousand years, if we would ever live that long. Because we could write about our own relationship with God. And you look in this, there is no doubt in my mind that each of us here has made our own mistakes. And I suspect some of them might have been some real deuces. And maybe you still live with the consequences of those mistakes. That's what the scriptures try to help us understand. That, God forgives. God forgives. You think about what some of the chosen people were doing. They had, human sacrifice. They had child sacrifice. They had, ritual prostitution. They had
All kinds of wives and.
God awful things that people did. Is that, and still they talk about God's tremendous love. Think about what you've learned from both successes and failures in your life. You think about what relationships mean. You think about how your relationship with God has changed from the time that you were in 8th grade. I certainly hope it has. That your relationship with God is not the same as it was when you were in 8th grade. That you think about what it means to you when you talk about what it means to suffer. Not because of any other reason than you happen to be number 21 and suffering went up to number 20, or I should say the lack of. And your dependence on God, your hope in God. Maybe ranting and raving at God at some point. That's okay too, by the way, because there's examples of that in there, of ranting and raving at God. And in the midst of it all, God still loves. We can all relate because this is human experience.
Thank you. Thank you.
Reading that, what is the story trying to teach me? And also, a biblical author named Michael Coogan says that reading the Bible without reference to this outside information that we have is like reading a play or going to see a play without having any knowledge of like the setting, the time period, that kind of thing. It wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. And that's the same with reading the Bible. So just two things to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think the rages today, you know, you have Harry Potter and you have Star Wars and you have Star Trek and you have a bunch of these just, I mean, huge blockbuster types of movies and such that are just all the rage and for a lot of folks. Why are they so hit? Because it taps into the human experience. They have nothing on what the human experience that this taps into. Nothing. Because those things haven't been around for a few thousand years. This has been around for a long, long time. There's tremendous, tremendous wisdom in there.
And I just want to say, so part of this Bible study was the point of that we can look at Genesis, but then also compare, contrast with the show, which is this weekend. So I hope you all are able to go and listen, watch, think about what we've talked about here with Genesis, think about what the play is doing. And then next week, we're going to kind of discuss and break open, compare, contrast, all that good stuff.
And part of my comments before the show will be to take some of this, but it's interesting when what you know now in a way, and you read the stories, think about that. You know, I hope you are at the musical, that think of that, hear the music and the songs, because the author has an interpretation. And I was listening last night, I was listening to it and I was making some notes of how the author's interpretation is different, obviously, than this interpretation here. Uses the same stories, but the interpretation is a little bit different. Many of the same themes come through, but there's a different twist. So something
Keep that in
to think
mind.
about.
And Father is doing a talk starts about 30-25 minutes
Yes.
before the show starts. So if anyone wants to do that too, it's
Is that
an
on
extension.
Genesis, or what are you gonna be?
No, it's on Genesis, and then it's doing a little.
Compare between the two. That's half an hour before.
It's about,
Okay.
so feel free.
All right,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good.
I'll have to do this again for some good conversations.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I did. Can I can upload it and I can send a link of it to you. Your email address? Want to write it on here? Okay.
So now you guys get to relax, go home, put your feet up.
Yeah, for the next
What were you living in?
11 hours.
Maybe you're gonna be working with me on Ask tomorrow.
Yes.
Meeting
I've
tomorrow.
got BU. I'm on the radio at 7:15.
That is very true, yes.
Ooh,
Listen for Lindsay on the radio tomorrow morning.
yeah.
What station?
Whatever the West
The
Bend.
West Bend one with Rick Jensen.
You teach a faithful.
Yeah, WBWI. FM something.
What is
Yeah.
101.3?
Seven Shirts, yeah.
When I walked in.
Ish. Well, there you go.
Oh,
And then
okay.
come up
I'm getting old. That's why.
It's time.
No, time, not that time that
I was
you're
gonna say,
getting old.
time for what?
No.
Miss Lynn.
Sorry.
Bye. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.